This is listener-supported community radio, KAAD-LP, 103.5 on your FM dial, Sonora, California, and also streaming on www.kaad-lp.org. I'm Wendy Ledger with the Golden Nuggets of the Motherlode, brought to you by the Sonora Writers Group and Tuolumne County Arts. And today we have the great fortune of having Blanche Abrams with us. Blanche, as president of the Writers' Roundtable in the Bay Area, was active in the literary movement for 20 years. She organized literary evenings, writing contests, anthologies, and poetry readings. Blanche served on committees to choose poet laureates for Pleasanton and Livermore. For the Alameda County Fair, she chose the judges and organized the poetry of over 100 poets. Her short stories have taken first-place awards at Las Positas College, and her essays, poetries, and short stories have been published in numerous anthologies and magazines. Edgar Allan's famous poem, The Raven, is a favorite of hers, which she performs for groups and functions. She now resides in the Motherlode and is a proud member of the Sonora and WOW writers groups. Welcome, Blanche.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for inviting me.
I love having you here. So first of all, I would love to know a little bit about you and your life in this area.
Well, I moved here about 15 years ago, and the first thing I did was look for a writers group to join because it would make me feel like a part of the community. And the Sonora Writers Group had an ad in the paper, and so I went to a meeting. At the time, Marilyn Martin was the president, and I stayed with the group for about 10 years. And then I left for a few years, and then Jill took over the group, and I came back, and I'm back here again, and very grateful to be. It's a very lively community with a lot of literary events constantly happening. And so when people think you move here from the Bay Area and there isn't anything happening, that's not true at all. There are so many readings and events, you can't go to all of them. So it's a good place to be.
That's true. And I would also say that we're very lucky to have you now as president of the Sonora Writing Group.
Thank you. That was a real honor. I didn't know that was going to happen, and it's great to be even more a part of it now.
So when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, actually, I didn't know. One of my teachers knew. I think I was about 11, and I wrote something like, "The lovely ladybug lilted on the lacy leaf," or something to that effect. And a teacher said, "Wow, I think you could be a writer." And I thought I could. But I actually didn't get started till I was a teenager and President Kennedy was assassinated. And it was a very emotional time. And I just started keeping a journal at that point and kept writing nonstop since then.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So who are some of your favorite writers and how have they inspired you?
I first got started as a teenager liking Edgar Allan Poe because at that time all the gory movies were coming out about people having their heads cut off and being buried alive. And so a lot of teens I knew got totally into the literary movement because of Poe. But I especially appreciate Faulkner. I like all of the old classic writers, and I usually look for books of classic short stories everywhere because you can have 20 authors in one book and study the writing style of each one of them, find out which ones are your favorite, and look at all of the tricks they use in their writing. And I think that taking a literary class in college was one of the best things I ever did because you'd have to reread the classics, which when you were in high school, you skimmed through just to get through and write the book report. But in college, when you read it, you don't understand it. A teacher explains it to you. It comes alive, and then you want to go back and read those classics to find out why something 50 years later is still as relevant as it was back then. I think that's a true art to be able to do that. And those are the writers I truly appreciate.
So I remember when I was in college, I was in a kind of a comprehensive poetry class, and it made very little sense to me. I was pretty overly intimidated by poetry, and so the only thing that got me through that class at that time was I used to go swimming after the class, and for some reason, after I swam, poetry made more sense to me.
Oh.
So I'm wondering, because you have shown in your biography that poetry has been a big part of your life.
It has been.
How did you get interested in it? And how would you encourage other people like me who have a hard time, like, getting immersed in poetry?
Well, what actually happened to me was the writers group that I joined in the Bay Area had a poet in the group, a gentleman named Kirk Ridgway, who memorized the poetry that he wrote, and then he would get up and perform it. And so I watched the expression on his face, and he would bring props. Like he wrote a beautiful poem about an eagle and about a feather, and he had a feather with him. He wrote one about an arrow, and he had the arrow with him. It just totally brought poetry to life for me. And then I started reading it more. And I think whatever writers group that you're in, you are encouraged by what they are doing. In the Bay Area, most of the people in the group I was in were writing poetry, or they were writing short stories and constantly submitting things to literary magazines to try to be published. And then we'd all pat each other on the back and throw parties. Yes. And then I came out here and everyone was writing novels.
Yes.
And I said, oh, wow. And here I'm writing. And I still kept writing short stories. I wasn't sure how to completely put a novel together. But lately, that seems to be clicking for me. And I have a lot of material I've written through the years. And I've put it all in stacks and been able to divide it into 3 different categories of my life. And now I'm trying to weave all that together. But the poetry, there's something different about poetry in that everyone can interpret it their own way. And so much of it is so beautiful, and yet it can be frightening, like in Poe. It speaks to everyone in a different language. But I think the best poetry is poetry that leaves a little bit for us to think about, but yet we can at least understand it. For a while, there were poets that were writing things that were so out there that you couldn't understand it. And I think they caused some people to turn away from poetry. At least they did me at that time because I didn't know what they were writing about. But truly, well, poetry, it's in the songs that we sing. It's in the advertisements on television. It's in children's books. Poetry is the language of life. It's all around us. And I still love it. I think I'm better at writing prose than I am at poetry, but you can take a tablet with you at the doctor's office and sit there and sketch out a poem, where taking all the pages of the novel you're working on is a totally different case.
That's true.
So it's snippets of time and beauty that you can produce. You have to go back and refine it, but and a lot of people like poetry. You don't have to put any punctuation marks in if you don't want to.
That's true.
But that's not why I like poetry.
So I think people often wonder about writers, like how they do it. Like, so do you have a writing practice?
No, I used to say it was the muse that would move me, but we can't count on that because our muses aren't always moving. A lot of times they're asleep. So currently the project I'm working on is about my life. So I have plenty that I can keep writing about. And it comes to me at all different times. Last night I couldn't sleep. I got up at 1 o'clock in the morning and wrote until 3. But my weeks are busy because I still work. And I'm busy with a lot of different things that I'm involved in. I wish I was the kind of person that would say, I'm going to sit down every morning from 6 until 9 and write. That hasn't been the case for me so far. I'm more of an extemporaneous, write under pressure kind of individual. So if I know something's due tomorrow, I could sit down today and in 8 hours write like 14 pages. Where if I try to write a couple pages every day, that doesn't always work for me.
Yeah, that's what I think is so fascinating about writers is that we often all do things differently.
Mm-hmm. And something works for everybody that may not work for us.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
I'm trying to be better about that. I just organized our office at home and I finally have a corner of my own. And I think all my books got organized and all my writing is getting organized. It's helter-skelter in my computer because it's about 20 years worth of writing. So now it's getting organized. And I think finally, now that I'm older, I'm getting my life together. So I hope it's completely together before I leave this earth.
So I wanted to talk to you about autobiography because it seems like that is an important part of your work. Mm-hmm. So how do you do that? How do you figure out? Because there's a very big difference between writing down like I was born here and I did this and this, that and telling a story.
Well, I had read somewhere that you should take each chapter that you're writing and think of an event that happened during that time of your life that was so important to you that you've never forgotten it. And that's what I've tried to do with the chapters that I'm working on. And I made a long list of all the important events during my lifetime. And I'm trying to center the novel around those events so that hopefully you keep moving forward. But in the first chapter, when I went back in my memory and said, what's something that struck me to the core at an early age? And it was the fact of understanding that my father shot the meat that we ate, and he shot my pet deer, and it was on the table. And when I realized that, after that, I didn't eat venison anymore. But about 20 years ago, for some reason, a line came to me, stayed in my mind, and it never went away. And it was, the gunshot split the silence, blood splattered the snow. And I always thought, what am I going to do with those lines, and why are they in my head? And it ended up being the first 2 sentences at the beginning of my first chapter of my book.
It's a wonderful thing.
So how does that happen?
I don't know, but I think, what you were illustrating there, I think it's so important to hear it and to give it importance and to pay attention to it. And even if you don't understand it at that time, to write it down.
Right.
And just, have it waiting. Yeah.
And one of the problems that I came into when I first started was that I have all these stories written about my life, but each one was written, and many of them were published as individual short stories.
Right.
So now I had to take all the short stories from like the first 13 years of my life and say, how can I weave these together?
Yeah.
And somehow it's happening. I'm kind of thinking of a theme and a way to do that. Like I wrote one whole chapter that was called Batty, and it was about the crazy things happening in my life, and there were 2 bat stories in there. Bats came out of our stove and got loose in our kitchen.
Oh my goodness.
I ended up using one of them for a pet. And so that became a story when I didn't know it was going to at first.
I've had that experience in novels where characters will show up and I'm like, who are you? And they're like, I insist on being here. And I'm like, okay.
Well, mine were really there, but I didn't know I was going to put them in the story.
Yeah. Yeah. That is so interesting. So I have had the great pleasure of hearing you read at Third Fridays. In Sonora, we have this thing called the Third Fridays, which is like the literary coffee house, which is also broadcast on this radio station. And you've already talked a little bit about the poet in your group who inspired you.
Yes.
But did you just always have a gift on being able to perform, or how did you hone that? Because you're such a wonderful performer.
I can blame my speech teacher in 8th grade.
Okay.
The very first day of the class, he said, here is something I want you all to memorize, and you will come back tomorrow, stand up in front of the room with no notes, and you will recite this story. And it was the Gettysburg Address.
Oh.
And so the very next day, and there were about 18 of us in the class, we each had to get up in front of the room and start reciting the Gettysburg Address from memory. And I remember that day, somehow I dressed too quickly, and I had 2 different colored knee socks on, and I was trying to cross one leg in front of the other, and I was a nervous wreck and trying to put my hands in my pocket. And he would very gently stop each one of us and say, take your hand out of your pocket, make sure you're standing straight with good posture, look out over the audience, think of everyone as naked, and everybody is just a normal human being, and don't be intimidated, and pick someone in the audience and stare to the back of the room, and then shift your gaze. And he did that. After 3 months, we were all like professional speakers. I still remember his name was Mr. Fitzgerald. And I've never been afraid to get up in front of people since then.
Have you had other teachers in your life that have inspired you for your writing?
Definitely. A class that I took, a literary class in the Bay Area in San Ramon, I had a teacher that had us read a classic story, and then we had to journal what all our feelings were about that story. And for homework, you had to turn your journal in once a month, and he would review all your thoughts on what your stories were. And I really felt that each one of these classic books came alive to me when I could somehow fit my own feelings and thoughts into those classic stories as to why they resonated with me. And it made a big difference. And he would take a classic story that I might start out reading that I just could not understand at all. And then the next day when we'd go back, he'd explain like the first 10 pages. And all of the Scarlet Letter was the one I really started having a problem with. I thought, this language, who understands this language? And what are these symbols? And what does that Scarlet Letter mean? And why do I need to know this? And then he explained what all the symbolism meant and everything. And I went back and I reread it afterwards over and over again. It became one of my favorite novels. But when you're reading something and don't understand it, you can have a tendency to just put it aside because it's not in the genre that you're used to reading.
Yes, I had a teacher in high school, Mr. Jones, and he taught us Shakespeare. And he would bring in classic recordings like Richard Burton, his Hamlet and stuff like that. And it was just thrilling. You know, the language was not a problem at all because we were all reading it together and he would explain things to us as we were going along.
And it comes alive.
Yes.
Those teachers are priceless.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm sure that many people listening to this broadcast would love to hear some advice from you about writing. Like if someone, you know, I have a book inside me and I really want to do this or I really want to write, but I've just never done it. What would you say to them?
Just get started. You may not know what you're doing, but just sit down and start writing out your thoughts, pouring out your thoughts, anything that's coming to your mind. And just start typing it into your computer or on a tablet of paper, handwriting, whatever it is that feels comfortable to you. And constantly keep reading because you learn from other writers. And by buying, even at thrift stores, you can find collections of short stories by famous writers. And look through them and you'll find the writers that bring the language alive for you. And you'll notice how they felt about things and what they were going through and that you're not the only one going through it. And if you're writing an autobiography, which I am, there are parts that are difficult to deal with that weren't the best times of your life, and it's kind of hard to go through that and to get it out there, but it's therapy when you do. And if your writing can somehow help another human being, then everything you put down on paper is worth it. The first reading I ever did was at a library, and I wrote about when I was raped when I was 10 years old. And I wondered if it was appropriate material and if I should have read it to an audience. And afterwards, about 8 women came up to me and said they had never been able to talk about it, had never been able to tell anyone, not even their mothers, about it, and that they didn't know how to handle it in any kind of a positive way, and that I showed them that you can. And I thought to myself, if I never wrote anything again, what I already did was worthwhile.
Yes.
So I think every single human being has something important to say to the rest of the world. But if you don't write it down, no one's going to know about it.
That's really true.
So just get started.
It's
and
wonderful.
then join a class where you can have a few other people review it with you, explain to you what's right about it, and then maybe help you a little bit with what needs to be fixed. And don't take it as criticism. Take it as you improving what you're putting down, what you're writing.
Yeah, what is your philosophy about feedback? Do you want feedback all the way through your process? Like, I'm a kind of a writer who I need to get out my first draft before anyone sees it. But how do you handle that kind of thing?
I prefer to have it reviewed. I'll usually do a chapter first, and submit it. And then I belong to another critiquing group, the WOW group, Women on Writing. And we submit writing to each other via email twice a month. So people have a week to review your work and really look at it. And then we sit down and we all talk about it. And I can't do without that group or without the Sonora Writers Group because we can think we've written something that's just fabulous and everything is fine. And then someone will say, well, I thought there weren't any bullets in that gun. How did you shoot someone with it? And go, oh my gosh, I forgot about the bullets, So something can be as clear as day to you, and to someone else, it's mud. You left something out. You don't see it. But my first experience with critiquing was when I was in the Bay Area, and a member of the group I was in held a critique group. And when he handed me back my first short story, it was so covered with red ink. I went home and kicked the walls for a week and thought I would never write again. And then I just decided it's either going to make me not stay with writing or it's going to make me stronger. And I kept going. I appreciate all the feedback I get. I may not always agree with all of it. That's okay. But I appreciate every bit that I get.
I really believe that part of being a writer is developing grit.
Oh, yes.
So we're now at the part of the program where you get to read.
How exciting. Well, I brought 2 short stories today. One of them is called Sound Memories. The 84 years of Grandma's life had been sorted into piles of which relative wanted what. They tossed in a heap the items they deemed unworthy. I noticed many of her cherished collectibles in that pile. Among them lay the Mr. and Mrs. Santa Claus figurines her best friend gave her. She lovingly displayed them beneath her miniature Christmas tree every year. The inexpensive windmill salt and pepper shakers I proudly gave her when I was only 6 met the same fate. Then I recognized the wool multicolored Indian rug that had always covered the top of her old Zenith radio. "Dad, where is it?" I inquired. "What happened to Grandma's radio?" "It's outside on the truck to go to the dump," he replied. I froze inside. "Please, can I have her radio?" "Chugger, why would you want it? It hasn't worked for years." Relentlessly I pleaded, and reluctantly he removed all the other furniture to get to the radio. He placed it in my station wagon, and I protected it with the Indian rug. On my way home, my mind was racing back to the past faster than the car could carry me forward. I was knocking on her front door at the same time I did every Saturday. The lace curtain parted slightly as she lifted it aside to peek out at me and smile. Walking through her foyer, I entered a world I so desperately needed, one where nothing ever changed. The rose-colored Victorian couch with a tufted back and doilies on the arms was in its proper place. Round mahogany end tables with matching milk glass lamps completed the ensemble. Oval antique frames presented her only husband who died decades before. There were also pictures of her 5 children who paid their respects often. She never raised her voice to them, nor they to her, and I never smelled liquor on her breath. An environment so far removed from my own as my parents were in the middle of a divorce. Voices raised, bitter words were unleashed, and children cried into the night. My mother searched for strength in the bottom of a brown glass bottle. Dad chose to simply walk away. But that was all in the other world, and I was in Grandma's now. The comfort afforded me by Grandma's home was exceeded only by the adventures we shared. No adventure would be complete without food. First, Grandma brought in her red Coca-Cola tray with a wiggling bowl of lime jello. She would head for the kitchen again, and I'd say, "Can I help you, Grandma?" She'd reply, "No, I don't want you to see what I made for you." Upon her return, she proudly set down her white bowl with juicy red watermelon slices next to the green jello. Her last trip was to bring my favorite treat, golden popcorn oozing with butter. Every Saturday, the snacks were exactly the same, but she acted like it was a surprise. And somehow it was. Armed with napkins, Grandma sat in her favorite chair with me at her feet, right next to her Zenith radio. Our eyes twinkled with excitement as she turned the dial, the speaker crackled, and a booming, "Hi-yo, Silver!" shattered the silence. I heard hoofbeats and envisioned Silver rearing on his hind legs, shaking his long mane. The Lone Ranger never ever fell off, and always wore his knee-high black leather boots, blue-gray pants, and the shirt with the black cross lace tie, and his gun belt with the silver bullets, just like in my comic books. Tonto was always by his side, dressed in brown fringed doeskin and moccasins with neatly jet-black plaited braids. He was different from anyone I had ever known. He and the Lone Ranger were the 2 men in my life that were real heroes. I believed they would never walk out on me like my father had. Grandma and I rode off with them every week. We searched for gold and stolen saddlebags and helped find the man with one leg. Grandma and I were kemosabe's all the way. We ended the afternoons sitting on her wooden porch swing, sipping lemonade and quietly gazing over her soft white peonies. I'd like to believe she needed my company as much as I needed hers. Her world was my daily reminder of the need for stability in an unstable family and the need for heroes when parents let you down. When I die, my children will probably discard the mahogany console filled with dusty tubes and rusty wires. To them, it is only an outdated piece of furniture that occupied a silent space in our hallway. But to this day, when I walk past Grandma's radio, I could swear I hear the sound of hoofbeats and catch the scent of freshly buttered popcorn. There's a poem I'd like to read to you also, titled Hiding Between the Pickles. My mother's footsteps fall on well-worn floorboards as I hide in the cold cellar between the pickles. I peer past crocks at jarred asparagus soldiers in scalloped helmets as they guard crescent peaches afloat in a syrup sky. Corn kernels cuddle lazily in a mellow yellow maze next to their sexy stewed tomato neighbors who salsa the day away. Crab apples chortle in skin-tight red suits. They chide the gangly green beans. Hey you, your string skin's loose. Plums all a-purple glisten with sugared sap, watched by tiny potato eyes through a burlap gunny sack. Cinnamon spiced Jonathans beg me, please release our lids, as a carriage of nutmeg pumpkin beckons, kindly step within. Oh, I hear Mom as she calls my name. I feel my fantasy tumble. All I want in the world is me, just hiding between the pickles.
Blanche, thank you so much for your story.
You're welcome.
It was really great. We have a writing group coming up we have it once a month.
Yes.
And this month of December, it'll be in the first week instead of the second week, which it usually is.
That's correct. It'll be Saturday the 9th. We have to give our venue over to the fire department and children for their annual toy drive. And who can say no to firemen or children or toys?
That's right. So we'll be there, and it's in Jamestown?
That's correct, at the community center.
Right.
10:30 to 12:30.
Right, and it's just a wonderful event. You have an opportunity to read aloud if you'd like to and get some critique from people.
Exactly.
Just hear what's going on. And there's often events to sign up for if you're a member of the group.
And everyone's welcome to come.
Thank you very much, Blanche, for being here today. This is Wendy Ledger with the Golden Nuggets of the Motherlode, brought to you by the Sonora Writers Group and Tuolumne County Arts at listener-supported community radio KAAD-LP 103.5 on your FM dial, Sonora, California, and also streaming on www.kaad-lp.org. Thank you very much. Thank you, Blanche.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.